My hands aren't working. 78 years is no joke. Once I could spend hours scribbling dates and names on a blackboard, but now I can't even hold a cup of tea. My youth is gone, leaving me with creaky joints and loneliness in an old house on the outskirts of New Haven. Whitney Griffiths is what it says on my birth certificate, a rare name that made me uncomfortable as a child, but one that made me stand out among my classmates at the university. Professor Griffiths. It sounded solid when I lectured at Yale University, telling students about the American Civil War and the great generals of the past. For 35 years, the American History Department was my second home, the real home I shared with Helen, my wife. She was a quiet but incredibly strong woman who carried on her fragile shoulders not only the household, but also my academic ambitions, my breakdowns before my dissertation defense, my doubts about the choice of a new research topic. We lived together for almost 50 years. 50 years that now seem like a single moment. Helen left me 3 years ago. Pancreatic cancer is a ruthless killer, giving no time to prepare or hope for a miracle. Only 4 months from diagnosis to funeral. She passed away in the fall, and since then, all seasons have been colored gray with loneliness for me. After her death, our only son Xavier began to visit me more often. Perhaps he was driven by a sense of duty or even guilt for rarely coming while his mother was alive. We were never particularly close to Xavier. He inherited only my stubbornness, not my love of history. He chose numbers over books, becoming a financial analyst for a large corporation. He's now 42 and a senior vice president of the company. For the first time after the funeral, he came every weekend. Sometimes alone, sometimes with his wife Persephone. Their marriage happened 10 years ago, but I still couldn't get used to this woman. Her name sounded like a mockery, an ancient Greek goddess forced to spend part of the year in the underworld. Our Persephone, however, did not appear to be suffering. A cold, calculating woman with perfect posture and perpetually pinched lips. She worked as director of public relations for the same company where Xavier worked. That's where they met. They never had children. Career first, then we'll see. Persephone always replied to questions about grandchildren that Helen sometimes dared to ask. I never asked. I realized it was none of my business. Though admittedly, I longed to hold a grandson or granddaughter in my arms, to pass on the history of our family, to tell them about the ancestors who came from Wales in the 19th century. Xavier and Persephone's visits became less frequent over time. First once a month, then once every 2 months. I didn't mind. I understood that they were busy people with their own lives, and it must have been hard for them to see me, aged, lost, wandering lonely around the empty house. And then the talk of inheritance began. Cautious at first, as if by accident. Dad, have you ever thought about what happens to the house when, you know? Xavier asked me at dinner one night. When I die, I said the word calmly. Death hadn't frightened me since Helen left. The house will go to you, of course. Who else would it go to? Do you have a will? I didn't answer then. I just changed the subject. But the questions kept coming, about my savings, about my retirement account, about the securities I'd bought with Helen a long time ago. Gradually, I began to notice that Xavier's tone was changing. Where before he'd been merely aloof, now there was irritation in his voice, especially when I refused to discuss financial matters or, God forbid, the sale of the house. Dad, you're 78 years old. Why do you need this huge house? You can barely even get up to the second floor because of your knee. This is my house, Xavier. It's your mother's and mine. Mom's been gone 3 years, he had a temper one time, and you're clinging to a past you can't get back. After that conversation, he didn't show up for 2 weeks. When he came back, he brought a brochure of an elite nursing home. Look at the conditions there, he said, leafing through the glossy pages with pictures of smiling elderly people. Doctors around the clock, a swimming pool, a library. You'll like it. And the house? I asked. It could be sold, Xavier answered too quickly. With the money, you could live there for years. Sell the house your mother grew up in? The house your grandfather built? He rolled his eyes, a gesture I always hated. It's just a building, Dad. Brick and wood. No point in hanging on to it if you can ensure a comfortable old age. I didn't argue, but I didn't agree either. I just put the booklet away in my desk drawer and never took it out again. The atmosphere grew more tense with each visit. Persephone almost stopped talking to me, only nodding in greeting and farewell. Xavier was getting more and more irritable. Once, when I accidentally spilled tea on the tablecloth, he banged his fist on the table so hard that the cups bounced. "You're doing this on purpose? You're making us helpless on purpose?" I didn't recognize this man as my son, that little boy whom I taught to ride a bicycle, to whom I read books about ancient civilizations before bedtime, hoping to instill a love of history. In April, an unpleasant thing happened. I forgot to turn off the gas under the kettle and dozed off in my chair. I woke up to the smell of burning. The kettle had boiled over and the wooden handle was charred. Good thing there was no fire, but I made the mistake of telling Xavier. "You could have burned the house down," he yelled, "and you could have burned yourself. You see, you can't live alone anymore." "It was an accident," I argued. "It can happen to anyone." "Not everyone, Dad. It's the elderly who need looking after." After that, the visits became more frequent, but now they were inspections. Xavier and Persephone came unannounced, checking the house, looking in the refrigerator, making sure the appliances were off. "We're worried about you, Dad," Xavier said, but his eyes said something else. I began to notice that some things in the house were going missing. The antique clock I inherited from my father, a silver candlestick, framed photographs. When I asked Xavier about it, he said he took the things away to be cleaned and restored. They never came back. In May, I fell ill. A common cold turned into pneumonia, and I spent 2 weeks in the hospital. When I returned home, I found that many of my papers had been moved, and the desk drawer where I kept my will had been broken into. These two events, the missing items and the breaking of the drawer, compelled me to act. I called my old friend and colleague Herbert, who taught law, and told him of my concerns. "Whitney, this is serious," he said after a long silence. "You need to protect yourself and your property." On his advice, I went to a lawyer and changed my will. Now the house and most of my savings were to go to the Yale History Department endowment. Xavier was left only a small amount of money. I didn't tell my son about the change. I decided to let this be my last lesson to him, a lesson that greed and disrespect for parents does not pay. The relationship continued to deteriorate. By now I was avoiding conversations with Xavier and Persephone, limiting myself to formal phrases. They too seemed happy to cut communication to a minimum. And then in early June, something unexpected happened. Xavier called me on his own, without the usual reminder from Persephone. "Dad, Persephone and I had decided to vacation in Florida for 2 weeks, in Pembroke Pines where a co-worker has a nice house, and we thought, maybe you could come with us." I was so surprised I didn't know what to say right away. "Why?" "What do you mean, why?" I could hear the hurt in his voice. "You're my father. We're family. It's time to make things right, don't you think?" I had my doubts. The turn from coldness to family vacation was too abrupt, but part of me, the naive part of me that still hoped to reconnect with my only child, clung to the possibility. "Sun, ocean, fresh air," Xavier continued. "It'll be good for you, and we all need a little break from each other, you know? A change of scenery." "I saw him." "What about your work?" I asked. "I took a 2-week vacation." Persephone, too. We'd been planning it for a long time. After a few days of deliberation, I agreed. Maybe this really was a chance to make things right. Maybe away from the home that had become a bone of contention, we could just be a family again. I packed my bags, carefully preparing for the trip, took my medications, my favorite book, my sun hat. I even bought new shorts, even though I hadn't worn them in 20 years. Before I left, I called Herbert. "Are you sure this is a good idea?" he asked. "After everything you've told me?" "No," I answered honestly. "But this is my son, Herb, my only son. I have to at least try." "Be careful, old man, and keep your cell phone on you." I promised to call every day and gave him the address of the house in Florida. On the day of my departure, Xavier and Persephone picked me up early in the morning. We loaded my small suitcase into the trunk of their brand new Lexus and headed to the airport. During the flight, I watched them. They sat next to each other, sometimes whispering, sometimes casting quick glances in my direction. I pretended not to notice and stared out the window at the clouds below, wondering what awaited me in Florida. I hoped for the best but prepared for the worst. History has taught me that sudden kindness often hides unseemly motives. especially when it comes to inheritance and big money. But I wanted to believe that my family history would prove to be an exception. As the plane began its descent over the sunny Florida coast, I smiled at my thoughts. Perhaps this would indeed be a new beginning, or maybe it would be the beginning of the end. Either way, I was ready to accept what fate had in store for me in the land of Pembroke Pines. Pembroke Pines greeted us with stifling heat. After a cool June in Connecticut, the Florida air hit me with a heavy, humid wave, making me instantly sweat. Xavier and Persephone didn't seem to notice the discomfort. They looked fresh and energetic, despite the long flight and the change of time zones. At the Fort Lauderdale airport, we were met by a cab driver, prearranged by Xavier. On the way to Pembroke Pines, I silently watched palm trees, shopping centers, and residential areas with neat houses surrounded by emerald lawns float by outside the window. Everything around him seemed artificial, like a movie set for a carefree life. Too bright, too perfect. "Daddy, do you like it?" Xavier asked, noticing my gaze. "I don't know," I answered honestly. "It's too well-maintained. It's called civilization," Persephone snorted, keeping her eyes on the screen of her phone. "Not everyone has the need to live in a museum of antiquity." I didn't say anything. I didn't feel like arguing during the first few hours of my vacation. Besides, I was starting to feel tired after the flight. My body, unaccustomed to traveling, needed rest. The house Xavier rented was in a gated complex with a guard at the entrance. It was a one-story spacious building with a terrace overlooking an artificial lake. Inside, everything shone with novelty. Glass surfaces, chrome furniture, minimalist design. Not a single book, not a single painting that could give the place personality. Impressive, wasn't it? Xavier proudly walked me through the house. 4 bedrooms, 2 baths, a pool in the backyard, and only 20 minutes from the ocean. "Whose house is this?" I asked, trying to imagine who could live in such a sterile space. "It belongs to Ethan Blackwood, a partner in our company. They rarely come here, mostly renting through an agency, but they give a discount for coworkers." Xavier showed me to my room, small but bright, with windows overlooking the lake. It had a single bed, a dresser, and a small table. The bathroom was across the hall. "Make yourself comfortable, Dad. Get some rest. Persephone and I will go grocery shopping, and then we'll have dinner together." Left alone, I laid out my things and lay down on the bed, feeling the fatigue spreading through my body. Despite the air conditioner on, the air felt too dry and artificial. I closed my eyes, hoping for a nap, but sleep didn't come. My mind was spinning with thoughts about the strange behavior of my son and his wife, about the abrupt invitation for a vacation after months of strained relations. In the evening, we had dinner on the terrace. Persephone prepared salad and steaks. Xavier opened a bottle of red wine. The atmosphere was almost friendly, except for the strained smiles and wary glances my companions exchanged. "How are the plans for tomorrow?" I asked, hoping to keep the conversation going. "We were thinking of going to the beach," Xavier answered, "in the morning, before it gets too hot." "Are you okay, Dad? Can you handle it?" "Sure," I nodded. "At my age, it's time to enjoy life, isn't it?" Persephone puckered her lips. "Come, you, just don't forget your hat and sunscreen. Sunstroke can be very dangerous at your age." "I taught history and I didn't spend my life in a library for nothing," I said softly. "I know about sunstroke firsthand." "Of course you do," she smiled, but the smile didn't touch her eyes. "Just worried about your health." After dinner, Xavier offered to have another glass of wine on the terrace. Persephone declined, saying she was tired, and retired to her bedroom. It was just the two of us under the starry Florida sky. "Dad, I wanted to talk to you," Xavier began after a brief silence, "about the future." I felt the muscles in my neck tense. This was it, the real reason for this sudden invitation. "I'm listening." "Persephone and I have been thinking a lot about your situation," he sipped his wine, avoiding my eyes. "And we've come to the conclusion that you need help." "What kind of help?" My voice remained calm, though my insides were seething with the anticipation of an unpleasant conversation. "Financial help. More specifically, help with your finances." Xavier finally looked at me. "Dad, you're not young anymore, and the gas stove incident proves that your memory is failing you, and you're still paying your own bills, managing your own investments." I'm doing a fine job, I interrupted him. Herbert helps me with the investments, and I always pay my bills on time. Herbert, Xavier grimaced. Dad, with all due respect to your friend, he's as old as you are. He's a lawyer, not a financier, but an honest man. Xavier ignored my implication. Honey, Persephone and I are proposing that you take over your finances. I do it professionally, you know. I could increase your capital in a couple years. Why would I do that? I asked you straight out. At my age, more money won't bring more happiness. It's not about happiness, Dad. It's about security. The assurance that you'll be able to afford the best care when you need it. Uh, uh, I'm sorry. I'm just concerned about you. And I think it would be wise for us to join forces. I could set up a joint account for your savings. That way we'd both have access to it. That's it. A joint account. Of course. I'll think about it, son, I said, trying to sound sincere. It's a big step, and I don't want to make it in a hurry. Of course. Xavier seemed to relax. Shush. We have plenty of time. 2 weeks to rest, to talk, to rebuild trust. I couldn't sleep for a long time that night. I lay in the dark, listening to the hum of the air conditioner and trying to figure out my son's true motives. Sure, he wanted control of my money, but why did he need to make such a spectacle of the vacation? Why couldn't he keep pushing me at home in Connecticut? The morning of the second day began with a trip to the beach. It was a hot day, even by Florida standards. We settled under a large beach umbrella that Xavier had rented for the day. I preferred to stay in the shade, watching the vacationers and occasionally glancing at my son and his wife, who were swimming close to shore. They seemed so carefree, laughing, splashing in the water. From the outside, a perfect couple enjoying a vacation. But I noticed how their behavior changed when they thought I wasn't looking at them. The way they chatter, casting quick glances in my direction. How their faces tense up when I approach. In the evening, after returning from the beach, I discovered my suitcase had been rummaged through. Things weren't lying the way I'd left them, and the cell phone that I remembered exactly what I'd put under my pillow was on the bedside table. I didn't bring it up at dinner, but I was even more wary internally. What were they looking for? A copy of the will? Bank records? On our third day in Florida, Xavier suggested a trip to a nearby mall. You need new summer clothes, Dad, he said, eyeing my faded shirt. Come on, it's my treat. I agreed, even though I knew it was another attempt to gain his trust. At the mall, Persephone separated from us, saying she had her own things to do, and Xavier and I went to the men's department. He was surprisingly generous, insisting on buying expensive pants, shirts, and even a new hat. I didn't resist. If he felt like spending money, so be it. Besides, on some things I really needed. Over lunch at the mall restaurant, Xavier started talking about finances again. Dad, I got a great investment offer, he said, leaning across the table to me. Stock in a new technology company that's about to go public. Insider information from a colleague. You can double your investment in 6 months. And you want me to invest my money? I looked him straight in the eye. Not just yours, I'm investing too. He looked genuinely enthusiastic. It's a win-win, Dad. Think about what kind of financial cushion you can give yourself. I already have a financial cushion, I replied calmly, and I prefer more conservative investments. That's because you don't understand the current market, he said with a condescending tone. Everything changes very quickly now. You have to know how to take risks. Or know when not to take risks, I countered. At my age, losing my savings could be catastrophic. Who's talking about losses? He almost exclaimed it. I'm guaranteeing a profit. No one can guarantee a profit in the stock market, son. Not even you. His face darkened with irritation, but he quickly pulled himself together. All right, let's not be hasty. Just think about it. And the joint account, too. When we got back to the house, Persephone was waiting for us. She looked pleased, as if the day had gone exactly as she'd planned. I noticed that there was a stack of papers on the coffee table in the living room, which she hurriedly put away when we entered. How was the shopping? She asked, kissing Xavier on the cheek. Productive, he replied. Dad is now equipped for a Florida summer. Wonderful, she smiled her fake smile at me. I have a surprise for you. I made reservations at a restaurant for tonight. They say they have great seafood. The restaurant was exquisite and expensive. Persephone was especially nice to me, asking about my teaching career, the books I was reading, my views on modern education. Xavier, too, seemed relaxed and friendly. If I hadn't known their true motives, I might even have believed that they were genuinely interested in me as a person, not as a source of inheritance. After a second glass of wine, which I didn't usually allow myself, Persephone gently turned the conversation to the subject of the Connecticut house. "Whitney, I realize that the house is Helen's memory to you," she said with a sympathetic smile. "But don't you think it's a little too traumatizing? A constant reminder of loss?" I sipped my wine slowly, considering my answer. "It's not traumatizing to me, but comforting," I said at last. "Every corner of that house holds a piece of Helen. Her presence soothes me." "But is it healthy to live in the past?" she insisted. "Sometimes you have to let go in order to move on." "I don't want to move on from Helen." My voice became firmer. "And the house isn't just memories of her. It's our family history. Your family too, Xavier." My son shrugged uncertainly. "History is good, Dad, but you can't live in a museum. A house requires constant maintenance, repairs. It's hard on you physically and financially." "I manage on," I answered, "and I have money to maintain the house." "Yes, but that money could be spent on more pleasant things," Persephone intervened. "Travel, hobbies, quality medical care. Why spend it on an old house that sooner or later you'll have to sell anyway? Here it is. It all comes down to selling the house." I was beginning to understand their plan: get power of attorney to manage my finances, and then convince me to sell the house to invest the proceeds. And of course, that investment would somehow evaporate or depreciate. "I'm not going to sell the house," I said firmly. "Not now, not in the foreseeable future, and that's out of the question." The atmosphere at the table changed instantly. Xavier and Persephone exchanged quick glances. "No one is talking about selling now," Xavier tried to smooth things over. "We're just discussing options for the future." "Sir, my future is tied to this house." I set my glass down. "And I'd rather not revisit the subject." The rest of the dinner was spent in tense silence. Occasionally Persephone tried to make small talk, but it didn't work. Xavier looked annoyed and disappointed. When we returned to the rented house, I retreated to my room immediately, citing fatigue. Closing the door, I leaned against it and took a deep breath. The situation was getting more and more unpleasant. It was clear that Xavier and Persephone weren't going to back down from their plans to gain control of my finances and home. I quietly pulled out my cell phone and checked it. No sign of forced entry, but I decided to call Herbert from the bathroom anyway, turning on the water to disguise the conversation. "How's it going in Florida, buddy?" My friend's voice sounded concerned. "Everything is going according to the predictable scenario," I answered quietly. "They want to get power of attorney to manage my finances and sell the house. Did you turn them down?" "Of course I did, but I'm afraid they won't stop." "Be careful, Whitney, and keep me in the loop. If anything goes wrong, I'll contact the local police right away." After talking to Herbert, I felt a little calmer. At least one person knew where I was and what situation I was in. But something told me that this was only the beginning. Xavier and Persephone weren't used to backing down when it came to money, and I had to be prepared for their pressure to escalate. As I lay in bed that night, I reflected on how my relationship with my son had changed over the years. When and where had I made a mistake in raising him? What had made him so greedy and insensitive? Or maybe he had always been like that, and I just didn't want to notice it. These bitter thoughts haunted me until dawn, keeping me awake. A week had passed since our arrival in Pembroke Pines. Each day followed a well-established ritual: a morning trip to the beach or pool, lunch at one of the local restaurants, and an evening at the house for dinner and conversation. On the surface, everything looked decent. We even took a picture together against the ocean, the first family shot in 3 years. But beneath that thin shell of normalcy, tension was building. Xavier and Persephone returned to the subject of the house and my finances every chance they got. Cautiously at first, then more and more insistently. I remained adamant, and with each refusal, their tone became more and more irritated. That morning, I woke up with a heavy head. The humid Florida air was bad for my joints, and the sleepless nights due to constant thoughts of my son and daughter-in-law's manipulations were draining me emotionally. Stepping into the kitchen, I found Xavier and Persephone at the breakfast table. They were whispering about something, but fell silent when I appeared. Persephone smiled strainedly and offered me coffee. I declined. The caffeine had been giving me palpitations lately. How about tea then? She suggested with a deliberate concern in her voice. You need something hot to drink in the morning, especially at your age. At my age, I repeated, trying to hide my irritation at the phrase they were using as a weapon. People are perfectly capable of deciding what they want to drink in the morning. Xavier threw Persephone a warning glance, but she only shrugged. Dad, we have news, Xavier said, setting aside his smartphone. We're going to need to be away for one day. A corporate event in Miami, attendance is mandatory. You're leaving me alone? I raised my eyebrows, not believing my ears. Would they really be so careless as to let me stay in the house unattended? Or is this part of some plan? If you don't mind, Xavier paused, it's just for one night. We'll leave tomorrow morning and return the day after tomorrow afternoon. Of course I don't mind, I replied, trying not to show my surprise. I'm quite capable of taking care of myself. That's fine, Persephone looked almost pleased. Just don't forget to take your medication on time, and don't leave the gas or appliances on. I'll try not to burn down your rented house, I replied dryly. Our shared rental house, Xavier corrected me with a smile that didn't affect his eyes. After breakfast, they left for town to go shopping, leaving me alone. I took the opportunity to look around the house more thoroughly. I peeked into their bedroom, the bed neatly made, the order perfect. A stack of papers on the bedside table caught my eye. Cautiously approaching, I noticed the law firm logo on the top sheet. The text was too small for my eyes, but I could make out the words power of attorney and estate administration. So they had already prepared the paperwork, just waiting for my signature. I quietly left the room, careful not to leave any trace of my presence, and returned to the living room. My heart wasn't pounding with fear, but with anger. Did they really think they could manipulate me so easily? That I would sign papers giving them control of everything I own? That evening, over dinner, Xavier returned to the subject of our financial relationship. Daddy, I've been thinking about our conversation about the joint account, he began, putting on his pasta. And I'd like to propose a compromise. We can open an account not for all of your savings, but just a portion of it, as an experiment. So you can see if my investment strategies work. How much do you expect to spend? I asked, pretending to consider his proposal. Xavier hesitated for a moment, then said, I think 50,000 would be enough to start. 50,000, I repeated thoughtfully. That's a lot of money for an experiment. But a reasonable amount for a serious investment, he added quickly. Smaller sums don't have the same effect. And what kind of return do you promise? At least 15% per annum. His eyes lit up with enthusiasm. And probably more. 20 or even 25%. Sounds too good to be true, I said, sipping from my glass. Mum. That's because you're not familiar with the current market. Xavier was beginning to lose patience. I do this professionally, Dad. I have access to information that ordinary people don't have. Insider trading is illegal, if I'm not mistaken, I said calmly. Xavier turned pale, then red. That's not what I'm talking about, his voice rose. I'm talking about professional analysis, which is not available to people without special education and experience. Like my friend Herbert, who has been helping me with my investments for the last 20 years. Herbert! Xavier almost spit out the name. Your Herbert is living in the last century. His strategies were obsolete before you even retired. And yet they've brought me a steady income all these years. I remained unfazed, which irritated my son even more. Enough to keep the house and not worry about the future. You could have so much more. He slammed his palm on the table, making the plates bounce. If it weren't for your stubbornness and distrust of your own son, Xavier, Persephone intervened, putting her hand on his shoulder. Let's not spoil the dinner. Mr. Griffiths is entitled to his opinion. Her tone was soft, but her eyes looked at me coldly. Mr. Griffiths, she'd never called me that before. Always Whitney or Daddy. That formality was the first clear sign that the masks were beginning to fall off. The rest of dinner passed in strained silence. After the meal, Xavier apologized and went out on the terrace with a glass of whiskey. Persephone stayed with me, ostensibly to help clear the table. You know, Whitney, she said as she loaded the dishwasher, you're being too hard on Xavier. He really wants to help. Help me or help himself? I asked bluntly. She froze for a moment, then continued her work. Both of you, of course. Families should support each other, shouldn't they? Exactly, I agreed. And I've always supported Xavier. Paid for his education, helped with the down payment on his apartment, gave him money for the wedding, but somehow his support always seems to come down to getting control of my money. You're being unfair. Her voice grew colder. Xavier loves you. He cares about your future. My future or my inheritance. Persephone slammed the dishwasher door shut and turned to me. Her face no longer hid her irritation. You know what? I was trying to be polite. I've tried to respect you as Xavier's father, but you make it impossible with your constant suspicion and stubbornness. I just want to keep control of what's mine, I replied without raising my voice. Is that so unreasonable? At your age, yes, she almost shouted. At your age, people should be thinking about how to make life easier for their children, not clinging to material things. Xavier came back from the terrace at her shout. He looked alarmed but not surprised, as if he had expected this scene. What's going on here, Ani? He asked, though it was clear from his eyes that he understood the situation perfectly well. Your father thinks we're after his money, Persephone blurted out. Ari, that we invited him here just for that. Didn't we? I asked quietly, looking directly at my son. Isn't that why we're here? So you can pressure me away from my familiar surroundings? So I can sign the power of attorney you have in your bedroom? There was silence in the room for a moment. Xavier and Persephone exchanged glances. Then my son slowly set the whiskey glass on the countertop. You went through our things? His voice sounded dangerously quiet. I saw the papers by accident, I lied. They were lying in plain sight. They were in the dresser drawer, Persephone exclaimed. You were looking for them on purpose. It doesn't matter where they were, Xavier interjected. What matters is that you violated our privacy, Papa. This is our bedroom, and you had no right to go in there without permission. Just like you have no right to dispose of my property without my permission, I countered. But that doesn't stop you, does it? Xavier's face contorted with anger. We're trying to help you, damn it. Why can't you understand that? You're getting old and infirm. You can't take care of yourself properly. I take care of myself just fine, I replied, and I will continue to do so without your help. Such a stubborn old man, Persephone intervened. We offer you better conditions, comfort, safety, and you cling to your old house as if it were the only thing you have. It's not the only thing I have, my voice remained calm. I have dignity and common sense, and I see right through you, both of you. You don't care about me. You only care about what you can get from me. Xavier grabbed the glass and threw it at the wall. The glass shattered. Whiskey dripped down the white paint. Enough, he shouted. Enough of these accusations. We invited you here to fix things up, spent money on this house, on restaurants, on new clothes for you, and you pay us with suspicion and insults. Did I ask you to do that? I asked. Did I ask you to spend money on me? To invite me here? No, of course not. Persephone stepped in. You never ask for anything. You only judge and criticize. Perhaps because I have a lot to criticize you for, I said quietly. For example, for trying to manipulate an elderly person to get their money. Some people call it financial abuse of the elderly. Financial abuse? Xavier looked like I punched him. You're accusing us of a crime? Harasurichunden. I'm just calling things what they are. You know what, Dad? Xavier stepped toward me, his face red with rage. You ungrateful old fool. We tried to be patient. We've tried to work things out peacefully, but you leave us no choice. What choice? Either you sign the power of attorney and we continue to take care of you, or, he took a deep breath, or you're on your own. On my own, I repeated. So you'll give up on me if I don't give you my money? Is that an ultimatum? It's reality, Persephone intervened. We can't waste our lives on a man who doesn't appreciate our efforts and doesn't trust us. I slowly stood up from the table. My knees ached and my back whined, but I straightened to my full height, looking down at them. In that case, I choose to be on my own. From now on. Xavier looked like he hadn't expected that answer. He blinked confusedly, then his face contorted with anger again. Great! Excellent choice, he almost shouted. Then get out of here, now! Xavier, Persephone put a hand on his shoulder, but he shook it off. No, I've had enough of him, he turned to me. Pack your things and leave. We don't have to put up with you in this house. You're kicking me out in the middle of the night? I asked, even though I already knew the answer. Yes. Xavier was so furious that he was almost out of control. You can stay in a hotel. You have the money you're so desperately defending. I nodded slowly and headed towards my room to pack my things. My heart was pounding, and my hands were trembling slightly, but not from fear, from indignation and anger. I could hear them arguing in the living room. Persephone was arguing something heatedly to Xavier, but he answered sharply and curtly. When I returned with my suitcase, they were waiting at the front door. Xavier looked a little calmer, but he was still furious. Persephone stood stone-faced. This is a mistake, Dad, Xavier said as I walked to the door. Last chance to change my mind. It's your mistake, not mine, I replied, and I'm not changing my mind. Then get out, he swung the door open. Your lodging is the street. I walked silently past them and out onto the veranda. The door slammed behind me with such force that the whole house shook. I heard the lock click. The night was warm and humid, typical of Florida. I set my suitcase next to the chair on the veranda and sat looking out at the dark surface of the man-made lake in front of the house. Somewhere in the distance, frogs croaked and the wind rustled the leaves of the palm trees. I didn't look for a hotel. I knew there weren't many in the area, and it would be problematic to get there without a car. Besides, I didn't want to give Xavier and Persephone the satisfaction of thinking they'd made me run. The veranda was spacious and covered, with comfortable chairs. I could spend the night here without much discomfort. Taking a light jacket out of my suitcase, I slipped it over my shoulders, protecting myself from the evening chill, and made myself comfortable. For the first few hours, I just sat there, thinking about what had happened. The anger slowly subsided, giving way to cold determination. Xavier and Persephone had crossed a line that could not be crossed. They had shown their true colors, and what I saw was neither forgivable nor condescending. Around midnight, I pulled my cell phone out of my pocket. The signal was weak, but enough to make a call. I dialed Herbert's number. Whitney? My friend's voice sounded worried. What's wrong? I briefly told him about the fight and where I was now. Damn it, Herbert exclaimed. Should I call the police? It's a crime to throw an old man out on the street. No, don't call the police, I replied calmly. Not yet, anyway. I have another plan. What plan? I want you to contact our old colleagues, Joshua Randall, who's now on the board of directors of the finance company, Lauren Blackstone, who's a columnist for the Wall Street Journal, and especially with Michael Everett of the Securities Commission. Why? Herbert sounded perplexed. Because I'm going to teach my son a lesson he won't forget, I replied. A lesson that greed does not go unpunished. I told Herbert my plan. He was hesitant at first, but the more I talked, the more he got the idea. It's risky, Whitney, he said at last, but I'll help. They deserve it. Cherie, thank you, friend. I felt a rush of gratitude for this man who had stayed by my side for so many years. What are you going to do now? He asked worriedly. You're not going to stay on the veranda until morning, are you? That's exactly what I will do, I answered firmly. I will not give up or run away. Let them think they've broken me. It will make my revenge all the sweeter. After talking to Herbert, I felt a surge of energy, despite the late hour. A plan began to form in my head, every detail falling into place. I knew my age and status would work for me. Xavier and Persephone thought my connections in the academic world were worthless in their corporate reality. They were sorely mistaken. By dawn, the plan was complete. It was multi-layered, time-consuming, and precise in its execution. But if it worked, Xavier and Persephone would lose far more than they'd hoped to gain from me. The first rays of sunlight illuminated the veranda. I pulled a notebook and pen out of my suitcase and began jotting down names, dates, amounts, anything that might be useful. Everything I knew about Xavier's professional life, about his co-workers, about the company where he worked. By the time I heard the front door open, it was about 7 in the morning. I quickly put my notebook away and assumed a relaxed pose, pretending I had just woken up. Xavier stood in the doorway, looking awkward and embarrassed. Behind him loomed Persephone with an unreadable expression on her face. Dad, Xavier began in a conciliatory tone, we overreacted yesterday. I remained silent, looking at them with an expression of tired disappointment. Nasha to come inside, he continued. We can discuss it over breakfast. Why? I asked quietly. To repeat yesterday's conversation? I'm not changing my mind, Xavier. Not today, not tomorrow, not ever. But you can't just sit here. He seemed annoyed by my calmness. You need to wash up, eat. I'll manage, I replied. You're leaving for Miami today, aren't you? For a corporate event? Don't worry about me. I'll find something to do. Xavier and Persephone exchanged quick glances. I could see the uncertainty in their eyes. Perhaps they didn't expect me to take their threat seriously, or more likely, their plans had changed after last night's fight. We can postpone the trip, Xavier finally said. If you want to talk, there's no need, I smiled weakly. Go ahead, I'm not going anywhere. I'll be here when you get back. They reluctantly retreated, closing the door. Through the window, I could see them arguing heatedly in the kitchen. Half an hour later, Xavier came out onto the veranda with a tray containing a cup of coffee, toast, and a glass of orange juice. Here, he said, setting the tray on the table next to me. At least have some breakfast. I nodded my thanks but didn't say anything. Xavier stood there for a few seconds, as if waiting for something, then sighed and went back inside. After another hour, they came out with the bags. Xavier looked worried. Persephone looked annoyed. We're leaving, Xavier said, stopping next to my chair. We'll be back tomorrow afternoon. Here's the house key. He put the key on the table next to the empty coffee cup. Please, Dad, don't do anything stupid. Come in the house whenever you want. Get some rest. Make peace with the idea that we only want what's good for you. I took the key and put it in my shirt pocket without saying anything. See you tomorrow, Xavier said, patting me awkwardly on the shoulder. Persephone didn't even say goodbye, just threw me a cold glance and headed for the car. As their car rounded the corner, I pulled out my cell phone and dialed Herbert. They're gone, I reported. Cornet, we can get started. Already started, Herbert replied with a note of satisfaction in his voice. Joshua and Michael are on board. Lauren is also interested. Now we need proof. We'll have it, I said confidently, getting up from my chair and heading for the front door with the key in my hand. Very soon we'll have all the proof we need. When the door closed behind Xavier and Persephone, I felt strangely relieved. The house that had seemed like a cage now seemed like a battlefield on which I could maneuver freely. The first thing I did was shower and change into clean clothes. Feeling human, I set about implementing the plan. My years in academia had taught me two things: thorough research and building strategic alliances. Both skills came in handy right now. I settled down at the dining room table with a notepad, pen, and phone spread out in front of me. I began by compiling a dossier on Xavier and his career. Over the years, he had told me many times about his work, the projects and deals he was proud of. Of course, he omitted details that might have seemed ethically questionable to me, an old-school man, but I listened attentively and memorized more than he intended. Xavier was vice president of financial strategies at Meridian Investments, a mid-sized company with ambitions to enter the premier league of the financial world. His role was to develop investment schemes for large clients. Persephone worked there as well, heading up the public relations department. A perfect match on paper. He creates financial products. She makes them look attractive to potential investors. My first call was to Joshua Randall, an old friend and former colleague who was now on the board of a rival financial services company. We had once taught the history of economic doctrine together, and then our paths diverged. He went into business, I stayed in academia. Joshua, old friend, I said after exchanging greetings, I need some information on Meridian Investments. Anything you can tell me. Whitney, I could hear the surprise in his voice. Why would you do that? I briefly explained the situation, not going into family details, but emphasizing Xavier's possible wrongdoing. You want to frame your own son? Joshua asked after a pause. I want justice, I answered firmly. If my son breaks the law, he should be held accountable like anyone else. Joshua sighed, but then there was a conspiratorial note in his voice. Well, I have to say, Meridian has been a question mark for a long time. Their returns have been consistently above market, which is suspicious in itself. Last year, they launched a new fund that promises a 20% annual return, which is almost impossible without serious manipulation. What kind of manipulation? I asked, taking notes. All kinds. From the usual embellishment of statements to the direct use of insider information, it's hard to say for sure, but I have contacts in the regulatory agencies who have been looking at Meridian for some time. Can you put me in touch with them? I can, Joshua answered after a short pause. But you'll need proof, not just suspicion. I'm working on it, I said, glancing at Xavier and Persephone's closed bedroom door. I might have what I need very soon. After talking to Joshua, I called Lauren Blackstone, who had a column in the Wall Street Journal. She had once been a student of mine, talented and ambitious. Now her analysis of the financial market was known for its sharpness and uncompromising nature. "Professor Griffiths," she exclaimed when she heard my voice. What a pleasant surprise. I didn't beat around the bush and told her about my suspicions about Meridian Investments and Xavier's role in the fraud. "Interesting," she said. "Well, I've heard whispers about them, but nothing concrete. You say you might have access to inside information?" "Perhaps," I answered cautiously. "But first I need to know what you're most interested in, what to look out for." Lauren thought for a moment, then said, "Their new high-yield investment fund raises a lot of questions. I'm particularly interested in their investments in the technology sector. They always seem to end up in the right companies right before stocks surge." "I see." I jotted that down in my notebook. "What about employees' personal investments?" "Oh, that's a great question." She sounded enthusiastic. "If we could compare their personal portfolios to the investments of the funds they manage, it could be very revealing." We talked for another hour or so, discussing various aspects of a possible investigation. Lauren gave me valuable pointers on what documents and information would be most compelling to publish. After that conversation, I ventured into the most difficult call of all, to Michael Everett of the SEC. We had met many years earlier at an economic history conference where I had given a paper on 19th century financial pyramids. Michael was just beginning his regulatory career at the time and was impressed by the historical parallels to modern schemes. "Michael, it's Whitney Griffiths," I said when he picked up the phone. "I hope you still remember me." "Professor Griffiths." His voice sounded surprised but friendly. "Of course I remember you. Your lecture on Ponzi schemes was one of the reasons I chose this career." I smiled despite the seriousness of the situation. "It's nice to know that your work has had such an impact." "Michael, I have a delicate matter," I began. "I suspect that Meridian Investments is involved in illegal practices, including insider trading." A long pause followed. "Professor," Michael finally said, "these are serious allegations. Do you have proof?" "I don't have any concrete documents," I admitted, "but I have reason to believe that I can obtain them. I took a deep breath. My son is the vice president of this company." "Your son?" His voice became even more strained. "Do you realize that this could have serious consequences for him?" "I do," I answered firmly, "and I'm ready for it. Ethics are more important to me than family ties." Michael was silent for so long that I began to think the connection had broken. "Okay," he finally said, "I can't officially open an investigation without concrete evidence, but I can tell you what to look for. And if you find anything significant, I promise we'll look into it thoroughly." After talking to Michael, I had a clear list of what to look for. Now came the hardest part of the plan, finding the evidence. And to do that, I needed to break into Xavier and Persephone's bedroom. I had no moral qualms about it. After they'd gone through my things, tried to manipulate me, and kicked me out of the house, my actions seemed completely justified. Besides, if Xavier was indeed breaking the law, the public interest outweighed the privacy issues. With a caution you wouldn't expect from a 78-year-old man, I opened the door to their bedroom. The room was perfectly tidy. The bed was made, every surface clean. I began to methodically examine everything that might contain important documents. Nightstands, dresser, closet. In Xavier's bedside table, I found my first clue. A small notebook with notes on meetings and transactions. Many of the notes were abbreviated, but some contained specific company names and amounts. I took a picture of each page on my phone. Then I discovered a laptop hidden under a pillow. It was password protected, but I knew Xavier well enough to assume he was using one of his standard passwords. After a few tries, his birth date, my birth date, his wedding date, I tried the combination he'd always used as a kid, the name of his first dog, and the year he'd gotten it. The screen unlocked. On the laptop, I found much more than I expected. Spreadsheets with detailed records of Xavier's personal investments, which surprisingly matched the fund's investments in the days before important corporate announcements. Emails in which he discussed outperformance strategies, a euphemism for insider trading, with colleagues. Presentations to clients where projected returns were clearly overstated. I methodically copied it all onto a flash drive I always carried with me. The process took longer than I had hoped. My old fingers weren't as deft with the keyboard as I would have liked. But in the end, I had enough material to keep both Lauren and Michael interested. The real find, however, was a folder in Persephone's dresser drawer, signed Project Phoenix. It contained detailed plans to rebrand the company, including name and structure changes, an obvious attempt to prepare for possible legal problems. Among the documents, I found a client list labeled Special Terms and Preferred Investments, a clear sign of selective treatment prohibited by securities laws. After several hours of searching, I carefully put everything back in its place and left the bedroom, carrying the flash drive with the invaluable data. The first thing I did was to call Herbert again to tell him about my findings. "Whitney, this sounds more serious than we thought," he said after I described the contents of the documents. "Do you realize that this could not only ruin Xavier's career, but also lead to criminal prosecution?" "Sir, I do," I answered, feeling a heaviness in my chest. Despite everything that had happened, Xavier was still my son, but I also realized that I couldn't let him continue to break the law. But he made his choice, Herbert. I warned him many times about the risks of aggressive investment strategies. He wouldn't listen. "What do you plan to do with this data? First, I'll send copies to you in case something happens to me, or if they discover I found their secrets. Then I'll contact Lauren and Michael and prepare for Xavier and Persephone's return." I spent the rest of the day organizing the information I had received and preparing materials for transmission. In the evening, I sent the encrypted files to Herbert, Lauren, and Michael with detailed explanations. I then called each of them to make sure they had received the data and understood its significance. Lauren's reaction was the most emotional. "Professor, it's a bomb," she exclaimed after a cursory review of the materials. "If all this is confirmed, it will be one of the biggest scandals of the year in the financial sector." "When do you plan to publish it?" I asked. "I need to double-check everything, get expert commentary, but I think in 3 or 4 days, the material will be ready. I will need your comment as a source." "No," I interrupted her. "I can't speak in public. Don't forget, this is my son we're talking about." "I understand," her voice softened. "In that case, you will remain an anonymous source. But be warned, Xavier might guess where the leak came from. That's a risk I'm willing to take." Michael from the SEC was more reserved, but I could hear the professional excitement in his voice. "If even half of this is true, Meridian is in big trouble. I'll turn it over to our investigations department immediately. But keep in mind, a formal investigation could take weeks, if not months." "I understand that. The important thing is to get the process started." I woke up the next morning with a sense of accomplishment. The plan had been set in motion, and now all I had to do was wait for the results. I cleaned myself up and decided to spend the day on the veranda, partly to enjoy the beautiful weather, partly so that Xavier and Persephone would find me there when I returned and thought I had never taken advantage of their permission to enter the house. They returned about 3 o'clock in the afternoon. I heard the sound of a car pulling up and took a relaxed pose in my chair, pretending to read a book. "Dad?" Xavier looked surprised to see me on the veranda. "You're still here?" "Where else would I be?" I asked innocently. "You said I could come inside, but I decided not to overstay my welcome." He looked embarrassed and perhaps a little guilty. "Don't be silly, of course you can use the house. It was a silly quarrel." "Was it?" I looked at him carefully. "It seemed to me that you were quite serious when you threw me out." Persephone, who was standing next to me, rolled her eyes. "Let's not start this conversation again. Whitney, go inside, take a shower, get some rest. We're all tired." I rose slowly from the chair, feigning fatigue and discomfort from a night spent outside. "How was the corporate event?" I asked innocently as we entered the house. Xavier and Persephone exchanged quick glances. "Productive," Xavier answered briefly. "Lots of important contacts, useful discussions." I nodded, pretending to believe him. In fact, I suspected there was no event. They just wanted to get away so they wouldn't have to see me or continue the unpleasant conversation. The day passed in tense calm. We avoided topics that could lead to another fight, talking about the weather, local attractions, and plans for the rest of our vacation. I tried to look resigned and even slightly depressed. Let them think their tactics had worked. In the evening after dinner, as we sat on the terrace, Xavier's phone rang. He glanced at the screen, frowned, and stepped away to talk privately. I watched his face. It grew more and more tense as the conversation progressed. When he returned, he looked worried. "Is everything all right?" Persephone asked. "I'm not sure," he replied, giving me a quick glance. "It was Andrew from the legal department. We seem to have a problem." "What kind of problems?" Her voice became harsh. "Not now," Xavier nodded in my direction. "We'll talk later." I pretended not to notice this exchange, continuing to stare at the lake with a pensive expression. But inwardly, I was exulting. It had begun. The gears had been set in motion, and the retribution machine was beginning to gain momentum. Later that night, I heard them whispering in their bedroom. Xavier's voice sounded worried. "Someone has sent a request to the SEC. They want to see all the documents on the high-yield investment fund." "So?" Persephone's voice was calmer. "We're fine with the documentation." "You know that's not exactly true." I could hear the irritation in his voice, especially after we restructured the portfolio last quarter. "Calm down. It's a routine audit. They do them regularly. Not as detailed. And why now? I don't like it." Their conversation continued for a while longer, but I'd heard enough. My plan was in motion. The request from the commission was only the first step, but it was enough to make Xavier nervous. The next 2 days passed in a strange atmosphere. On the surface, we behaved as usual. We went to the beach, ate at restaurants, discussed neutral topics. But I noticed Xavier constantly checking his phone and sometimes stepping away to make a call. Persephone looked tense too, though she tried to hide it. On the third day after my discovery, thunder rumbled. Over breakfast, Xavier's phone blasted a series of notifications. He glanced at the screen impaled. "What is it?" Persephone asked, noticing his reaction. Instead of answering, Xavier simply turned the screen toward her. I couldn't see what was on it, but I could tell from her reaction, the sharp intake of breath and the widening of her eyes, that it was something serious. "We need to get back to New York," Xavier said, getting up from the table. "Immediately." "What's going on?" I asked with feigned concern. "Nothing serious, Dad," Xavier replied, avoiding my gaze. "It's just a work matter that requires our personal presence. We have to cut our vacation short." "I understand," I nodded. "Work comes first." "We can't leave you here alone," he said, looking at Persephone as if seeking support. "But taking you with us right now?" "Don't worry about me," I said with a wave of my hand. "I can get back to Connecticut on my own. I'll book a plane ticket for tomorrow or the day after." "Are you sure?" I could hear the relief in his voice. It was clear I was the least of his worries right now. "Absolutely. Go deal with your issues. I'll handle it." They were assembled in record time. Xavier barely spoke, completely focused on his phone. Persephone was more collected, but I could see the tension in her every move. Before leaving, Xavier took me aside. "Dad, I'm leaving you money for the ticket and a cab to the airport. And here are the keys to the house. The owners said you can stay for the rest of the week if you want." "Thank you, son." I took the money and the keys. "I hope everything works out for you at work." He nodded, not looking me in the eye, and hurried toward the exit, where Persephone was waiting with his bags. When the door closed behind them, I let myself smile. The plan had worked even faster than I'd expected. I didn't know exactly what had caused their hasty departure, a request from the commission, a leak to the press, or something else. But it was clear that my actions had accomplished their goal. I pulled out my cell phone and dialed Herbert. "They've gone," I said when he answered. Something had obviously happened. Xavier looked like a man who had seen a ghost. "No wonder," Herbert replied. "Didn't you see the financial news this morning? Meridian is down 15% after rumors of a possible investigation into their practices. No specific charges yet, but the market is nervous." "Already?" I was surprised at the speed of things. "The financial world lives on rumors, my friend. And rumors travel fast, especially bad ones. Plus, I hear Lauren's planning a big story for tomorrow." I leaned back in my chair, feeling a strange mixture of satisfaction and sadness. Revenge had begun to take place, and its consequences were beyond my expectations. But I also realized that I had just possibly ruined the career and future of my only son. "Do you have doubts?" Herbert asked, catching my silence. "No," I answered firmly. "I'm doing what I have to do. If Xavier broke the law, he has to answer for it. Just like he'd make me answer for it if he got control of my finances. What are you going to do next?" "I'm going to go back to Connecticut and watch events unfold. I think we'll have a lot of news from the world of finance soon." I returned to my home in Connecticut 2 days after Xavier and Persephone had left Florida in a hurry. The old walls greeted me with the familiar creak of floorboards and the smell of books, the smell of history that had been accumulating here for decades. The first thing I did was call Herbert to announce my return. My old friend insisted on coming over immediately, and an hour later, we were sitting in my office with cups of hot tea. "Tell me what's happened these days," I asked, making myself comfortable in my chair. Herbert took several newspapers out of his briefcase and laid them out in front of me. The headline screamed, "Major Investigation at Meridian Investments. Securities Commission Investigates Fund. Meridian shares collapse amid rumors of fraud." "It all started the day after you called Michael," Herbert said. "At first it was just rumors of a possible audit. But when Lauren published her article detailing the company's questionable practices, things exploded. I picked up the Wall Street Journal with a big front-page article. Lauren didn't cite me as a source, but the details were clearly from documents I'd handed over. She wrote about the fund's suspiciously high returns, the overlap between the executive's personal investments and the fund's decisions, in Project Phoenix, which she interpreted as an attempt to cover her tracks. "What about Xavier?" I asked, feeling my heart clench. Herbert frowned. "The board of directors had suspended him pending an investigation. His name isn't mentioned in official statements, but everyone in financial circles knows he was the architect of the fund that's now in the crosshairs." I leaned back in my chair, feeling a strange mixture of emotions. Satisfaction with a plan that was working, and pain for my son, who despite everything that had happened, was still my flesh and blood. "What about Persephone?" For now, officially, she's still working. But her department is responsible for all of the company's public communications, so she's in the middle of a crisis. The fourth day after I got back, the doorbell rang. I wasn't expecting company, so I went to open the door with some trepidation. Persephone stood on the threshold. She looked different from her usual flawless appearance, her hair disheveled and her clothes wrinkled. There were dark circles under her eyes as if she hadn't slept in several nights. "May I come in?" Her voice sounded hoarse. She walked into the living room and sank down on the couch without taking off her coat. "Do you know what's going on with Meridian?" she asked bluntly. "I've read in the papers," I answered neutrally. "Some trouble with the SEC, I think." "Don't pretend," she said, a steely tone in her voice. "Hornfwat. We both know it's not just some trouble. The company's falling apart. Xavier's been suspended. My team is working around the clock, but it's like putting out a forest fire with a glass of water." "I'm sorry to hear that," I said sincerely, "but I don't see what this has to do with me." "Don't play naive," she said, stepping forward. "The leak happened right after we left Florida. The documents were stored in our bedroom. You were the only one who had access to the house in our absence." I met her gaze calmly. "Are you accusing me of something specific, Persephone?" "I'm accusing you of ruining our lives." She raised her voice. "You stole confidential documents and released them to regulators and the press. That's treason." "An interesting accusation from a man who tried to manipulate an elderly father for profit," I remarked quietly, "who kicked me out of the house, forcing me to spend the night on the veranda. Speaking of betrayal, maybe we should start with your actions?" She was speechless for a moment, then continued more quietly. "We just wanted to help you. Yes, perhaps our methods were not the most delicate, but we never wished you harm. And you've destroyed everything Xavier's worked for over the years. If what he was doing was legitimate, he has nothing to fear from an investigation," I replied firmly. "You're not that naive," she grinned. "In the financial world, an investigation alone is a conviction. No one waits for the results. Clients leave, investors sell stocks, careers are ruined." I remained silent, realizing she was right. But at the same time, I couldn't help but wonder, If Xavier had really broken the law, didn't he deserve the consequences? Why did you come? I finally asked. What do you want from me? I came to ask if you realize what you've done. This isn't just a blow to Xavier's career. It's a blow to our whole lives. We have mortgages, loans. Without his salary, we can't cover all our expenses. We could lose the house. And if the investigation leads to a criminal case, he could lose his license. Do you realize what that means to a man who's dedicated his whole life to this? I felt a weight growing inside of me. Yes, I wanted to punish them for their manipulation, but I didn't realize how far-reaching the consequences would be. Where is Xavier now? I asked after a pause. At home, trying not to go crazy. She looked away. He doesn't leave his office, barely speaks to me. I've never seen him so broken. The words hit me harder than I expected. The image of the strong Xavier I knew didn't fit well with the description of a man who locked himself in his office out of desperation. I'm sorry it's come to this, I said sincerely, but I can't take full responsibility for a situation that began long before the Florida trip. What do you mean? She frowned. Your attempts to gain control of my finances, manipulation, pressure. It didn't start yesterday, Persephone, and it culminated when you kicked me out of the house when I refused to submit to your demands. She opened her mouth to object, but then simply lowered her head. We shouldn't have done that, she admitted quietly. It was wrong. But did our actions deserve such retribution? I wondered. Did the punishment really fit the offense, or had I gone too far? What do you want me to do? I asked bluntly. The commission already has the documents. The investigation is underway. I can't undo everything. You could talk to your contacts, explain that it was a mistake, that the documents were taken out of context, and lie under oath if necessary? I shook my head. I can't do that. She stood up and I noticed her hands were shaking. Then I don't know why I came. Perhaps I hoped you still had compassion for your own son, that you didn't want to completely ruin his life. I didn't mean to do that, I answered quietly. I wanted to teach a lesson, to show that you can't try to manipulate people with impunity, even if those people are your parents. But I never wished Xavier any real harm. Then you've miscalculated, her voice trembled, because evil has already happened, and it's only going to get worse. With those words, she headed for the exit. Persephone's words haunted me all day. I tried to distract myself by reading, even going out into the garden to prune the roses Helen had once planted. But my thoughts kept returning to Xavier. The next morning, I saw a news report that made me chill. High-ranking Meridian Investments employee commits suicide amid investigation. With trembling hands, I dialed Xavier's number. When the call went to voicemail, I felt panic overwhelm me. In desperation, I called Xavier and Persephone's home number. To my relief, the receiver was picked up by Persephone. It's me, I said, wasting no time in greetings. I saw the news. That employee. It wasn't Xavier, she answered briefly. It was Alan Foster, the head of the trading department. He left a note confessing to manipulating the fund's data. He feared criminal prosecution. The wave of relief was replaced by renewed concern. How's Xavier? How do you think? Her voice sounded tired. Alan was his colleague and friend. They'd set up the foundation together. Now Alan was dead, and Xavier would likely be held responsible, even if he didn't know about the wrongdoing. Persephone, I have to talk to him. Sidur. He's not here, she answered after a pause. He left last night and didn't say where he was going. He only left a note saying he needed to think. Do you have any idea where he might be? If I did, I'd be there by now. We had a fight before he left. A big one. About what? I asked, even though I already knew. About you, of course. About my going to see you. He said I'd betrayed him, trying to make a deal with the man who'd ruined his career. She paused. And then he said it was over. That our marriage was a mistake from the beginning. I closed my eyes, feeling a wave of guilt. Not only was Xavier's career crumbling because of my actions, but also his marriage. I'm sorry, Persephone, I said sincerely. I'm not sure I believe you, she replied, but it doesn't matter anymore. After that conversation, I spent several days in anxious anticipation. I tried to call Xavier, but to no avail. Meanwhile, the situation around Meridian was deteriorating. After Alan's suicide and his confession, the commission expanded the investigation to include senior management. Articles hinting at possible criminal charges began to appear in the press. Xavier's name was mentioned more and more. A picture of my son leaving the commission building appeared on the front page of the New York Times. He looked haggard, with a wan gaze, not like the confident man I knew him to be. Finally, on the fifth day, the phone rang. Xavier. Dad, his voice sounded hoarse. We need to talk. Of course, son, I felt my heart clench. Can you come over? I'm on my way. I'll be there in an hour. Xavier, standing on the doorstep, looked like a shadow of himself. Slim, with stubble and wrinkled clothes, he looked older than his years and tired. It was you, wasn't it? He asked, looking me in the eye. You gave the documents to the commission and the press? Yes, I answered calmly. He nodded as if confirming what he already knew. Why, Dad? There was no anger in his voice, only tiredness and bewilderment. Do you really hate me that much? I don't hate you, Xavier, I stepped forward. I never hated you. But the way you and Persephone treated me, the manipulation, the pressure, and then you kicked me out of the house, forced me to spend the night on the street. I wanted you to realize that such actions have consequences. Consequences? He grinned bitterly. Oh yes, there are. My career is ruined. My marriage is all but over. I could lose my house, my savings. I could be criminally prosecuted. Are those enough consequences, Dad? Are you happy? His words hit the mark, making me realize the magnitude of what I'd done. I didn't mean for it to go this far, I admitted quietly. I wanted to teach you a lesson, not ruin your life. But you did, he said, bitterness breaking through his voice. And you know what the ironic part is? I didn't even know about Alan's manipulation of the Foundation's data. I suspected that some of the metrics were too good, but I preferred not to ask questions. That makes me guilty of negligence, but not the outright fraud I was accused of. I remained silent. Did I believe Xavier didn't know about the fraud, or was he trying to minimize his guilt? What are you going to do now? I finally asked. I don't have many options, he shrugged. Cooperate with the investigation, hope for a lenient sentence. Maybe I can avoid prison, but I can't work in the financial sector anymore. That ship has already sailed. It's been a month since Xavier came to my house. The heavy, revelation-filled conversation left us both devastated. My son had left late that night, and since then, we'd communicated only by phone. Rare, awkward conversations in which we both carefully avoided mentioning the past and what was happening now with his career. But I knew. Of course I knew. Every day I watched the financial news following the development of the scandal surrounding Meridian Investments and Xavier's role in it. Events were unfolding at an alarming rate, like an avalanche that was unstoppable. 2 weeks after our conversation, the SEC released the preliminary results of its investigation. The 40-page document detailed the irregularities found in the operation of the high-yield investment fund that Xavier managed. Manipulation of return data, selective disclosure of information to clients, use of insider information. The list was long and impressive. Xavier's name was mentioned 17 times in the report, always in the context of his leadership role. Although the report did not explicitly state that Xavier was personally involved in the fraud, the conclusion was self-evident. As a supervisor, he either knew about the violations or was inexcusably negligent. The next day, I called Herbert. Did you see it? I asked him as soon as he picked up the phone. I saw, he replied gravely. The commission doesn't usually release such detailed preliminary reports unless they are sure of the conclusions. They're clearly preparing for serious sanctions. And what would that mean for Xavier? At best, a huge fine and a ban on working in the financial sector. At worst, criminal prosecution. I felt my heart sink. Yes, I wanted to teach my son a lesson, but I never wanted him to go to prison. A week later, Persephone called me. Her voice sounded distant, almost mechanical. I've filed for divorce, she said without preamble. I think you should know. I'm sorry to hear that, I replied, and it was true. In spite of our differences, I had never wished for the breakup of their family. I don't think so. There was no anger in her voice, only weariness. After all, that's part of your revenge too, isn't it? I never sought it, Persephone? Perhaps, but you should have seen it coming. When careers fail, marriages often fail, especially a marriage such as ours. The next day, even more disturbing news arrived. The shareholders of Meridian Investments had filed a class action lawsuit against the company and its executives, including Xavier. They were seeking compensation for the damage to their investment. The claim was for more than $100 million, a figure that meant that even if Xavier avoided criminal penalties, he could be in debt for the rest of his life. I tried to contact my son, but he wasn't answering his cell phone. In desperation, I called his home number, but a mechanical voice said the phone was disconnected. Finally, after 2 weeks of silence, Xavier called himself. Hi, Dad. His voice sounded strangely calm. I'm sorry I haven't been in touch. There's been a lot of things. I understand, I answered cautiously. How are you? Better than you'd expect, he paused. I made a deal with the prosecutor's office. Full cooperation in exchange for a reduced sentence. No jail time, just a fine and a 10-year ban from the financial sector. What are you going to do now? Succumb. I don't know yet. Maybe leave the country. Start over somewhere where the name Xavier Griffiths doesn't mean anything to people, he said quietly. Persephone filed for divorce. I know, she called. Of course, he grinned bitterly. She'd always been good at keeping in touch, even with people she despised. Xavier, don't, Dad, he interrupted me. I've made a lot of mistakes, turned a blind eye to things I should have noticed. Let greed and ambition cloud my ethics. You just hastened the inevitable. I'm sorry things turned out this way, I said, feeling a lump in my throat. If there's anything I can do to help. No, his answer was quick and firm. I can handle myself. I always have. A few days later, the doorbell rang. A messenger stood on the doorstep with a large envelope. Whitney Griffiths? He asked. It's for you. You have to sign for it. Inside was a newspaper, the Wall Street Journal, dated today. On the front page was a large headline. Meridian Investments collapses. Company declares bankruptcy. After the investigation results were published, clients began to withdraw funds en masse, the stock collapsed, and the company could no longer service its obligations. The board of directors decided to liquidate. The paper was accompanied by a note written in a familiar handwriting. You made it, Dad. Congratulations. K. I felt a lump rise to my throat. Xavier thought this news was supposed to be satisfying. He didn't realize that I never wanted the complete destruction of a company that employed hundreds of people who had nothing to do with the machinations. He didn't realize that my revenge had long ago ceased to bring me joy. I went to an address I had learned from mutual acquaintances, an apartment building on the outskirts of New Haven. The concierge informed me that Mr. Griffiths had moved out 3 days ago without leaving a new address. My son has disappeared from my life. Maybe he really did leave the country like he said. Started a new life somewhere far away, where the name Xavier Griffiths meant nothing. And in that new life, there was no room for the father who had taken such cruel revenge on him. In the days that followed, I tried to find Xavier. I contacted former co-workers, friends, even hired a private investigator. But my son seemed to disappear. Persephone, whom I managed to contact, only coldly informed me that after signing the divorce papers, she had no contact with him. Revenge, intended as a lesson in the consequences of greed and manipulation, had turned into something far more devastating than I could have anticipated. I wanted to shake my son's self-confidence, to make him realize the wrongness of his actions towards me. But instead, I completely ruined his life, leaving him without a career, without a family, without a reputation. And what did I get in return? An empty house, sleepless nights, and the bitter realization that revenge, even the most just revenge, is not truly satisfying. One evening, going through old photo albums, I came across a picture taken on Xavier's 5th birthday. A little boy is blowing out the candles on a cake, and Helen and I are standing side by side, happy and proud. Looking at that picture, I realized with painful clarity, despite all the wrongs, despite his mistakes and my revenge, Xavier will always be my son, Helen and I's legacy in this world. I pulled out a blank sheet of paper and wrote the letter. I didn't know if it would ever reach its destination, but I felt the need to express my thoughts. When I finished the letter, I sealed it and set it aside. Perhaps it would never reach Xavier. Perhaps even if it did, he wouldn't want to read it. But I felt I had taken a step, a small tentative step, away from revenge toward perhaps forgiveness. Not reconciliation, for that the wound was too fresh, the rift too deep, but perhaps toward understanding. In the morning, I went out into the garden and sat on our bench with Xavier. I looked at the house I had tried so desperately to keep and thought, was it worth the price we had paid? My revenge was complete, utterly and irrevocably accomplished. Xavier had lost everything he valued: his career, his status, his wife, his reputation. But I'd also lost something important: my son, the only person I'd lost since Helen's death. And sitting in the silence of the fall morning, I couldn't tell which of us had lost more. Maybe someday, I thought, looking down the road toward my house, Xavier would come back. Not with an apology, we're both too proud for that, but just to sit next to each other on this bench and start a conversation that might lead to understanding, to acceptance that we both made mistakes. Both cause pain, both deserve a chance at redemption. In the meantime, I sat alone, surrounded by the ghosts of the past. An old man who won a war he shouldn't have started. A father who lost his son in a battle over principles that may not have been worth it. My vengeance is complete, but the price was too high.